Hello everyone, and welcome to my Bold and Beautiful Gossips 24 channel. I hope everyone is having a wonderful day. Before we begin, please hit the subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up. Brooke Logan had lived through heartbreaks, betrayals, weddings, annulments, scandals, miracles, and more than her fair share of impossible twists, but nothing, absolutely nothing, prepared her for the moment she opened the door to the small private office at the back of the hospital and found Nick Marone sitting in the dim light, shoulders collapsed inward as if someone had taken a hammer to the very structure of his soul, staring down at a piece of paper that seemed to drain the life out of him. With every passing second, she had come here expecting a brief conversation, maybe a tense one given their history, maybe a complicated one as conversations with Nick always had layers and buried memories and decades of unresolved tension. But she never expected this. Never expected to feel her heart drop into the hollow pit of her stomach as she whispered his name, and he didn't even look up at first, as though he could barely lift the weight of his own grief. When he finally raised his eyes toward her, Brooke felt the room tilt. There was something in his expression, something too raw, too resigned, something that made the air itself feel heavy. She walked toward him slowly, almost afraid of the words she already sensed were coming, and when he handed her the paper with a quiet, defeated, "It's cancer, Brooke. Stage 4. She felt her breath catch so sharply that it hurt. She had lived long enough to know the difference between fear and the kind of terror that came with real, devastating news. This was the latter, the kind that left your hands trembling and your voice trapped somewhere deep in your chest because your mind couldn't accept the truth fast enough. Nick didn't speak at first. He didn't need to, because his silence said everything. The fear of dying, the fear of leaving behind the people he loved, the fear of running out of time. Brooke sat down beside him, her hand instinctively reaching for his, and for a long moment neither spoke. They just breathed, two people suddenly reminded that life could turn in an instant and leave you gasping for stability. Nick confessed that he had been ignoring symptoms for months, brushing off pain as stress, fatigue as overwork, and the cough that kept returning as nothing more than the remnants of a cold he'd never fully shaken. By the time he finally agreed to test, the damage was already extensive, too extensive. The doctor's words echoed in his mind like a punishment. Advanced, aggressive, metastasized. It was the kind of diagnosis that stole hope before you even had a chance to fight back. And Brooke could hear the defeat in every word he forced out. She told him they would face it together, that he wasn't alone, that treatments existed and miracles happened, and that he had survived impossible things before. Storms, shipwrecks, heartbreaks, but Nick simply shook his head, eyes dark with the heaviness of someone who had already imagined the worst. He wasn't afraid of pain, he said. He was afraid of the people he loved watching him fade. He had lived a complicated life, made mistakes he couldn't erase, but he had also tried to be a good man in the ways he knew how, and now the idea of leaving the world unfinished felt unbearable. Brooke felt tears burn in her eyes as she remembered the version of Nick she had once shared a life with, the sailor with the fierce heart, the father who tried so hard, the man who had loved her at one point with a sincerity she never forgot. And even though their lives had diverged, she still cared, still saw pieces of the man she once dreamed of in moments like this when the walls fell away. She squeezed his hand harder, refusing to let him disappear into despair. But while Brooke was trying to hold herself together in that room, chaos was brewing across the hospital as Steffy Forrester, already overwhelmed with tension from her family's battles and the strain of trying to hold Forrester Creations together during yet another crisis, found out in the harshest way possible that something catastrophic was unfolding. She had run into a nurse carrying Nick's chart, accidentally glimpsing the words that didn't look real. Metastatic spread, late stage, limited options. At first she thought it must be someone else's file, another patient, another life, because Nick was strong, Nick was stubborn, Nick was practically invincible in her mind. But when the nurse quietly confirmed it, Steffi couldn't stop the immediate breakdown that followed. She staggered into an empty hallway, gripping the wall to stay upright as tears poured uncontrollably down her face. Not just because she had known Nick for most of her life, not just because he had once been a complicated but important figure in the tangled Forrester world, but because this news felt like another blow in a year already filled with too much pain and too much loss. She had barely recovered from the trauma of Sheila, barely pieced together her marriage to Finn, barely stabilized her family and her own sanity, and now she was being told that another person she cared about was slipping away. She felt helpless, furious at the unfairness of life, shaken to her core by the realization that no matter how strong you were, no matter how many battles you survived, cancer didn't care. Could strike anyone. Could steal the strongest men. It could destroy the toughest spirits. And suddenly the weight of everything she'd been carrying, the stress of her leadership role, the pressure of motherhood, the fragile peace between the Forresters and Spencers, collapsed at once, leaving her sobbing with a force she couldn't control. Finn found her moments later, wrapping his arms around her even before he understood what had happened. When Steffy choked out Nick's name, Finn already knew the weight behind it. He had seen the charts earlier but had been sworn to discretion until Nick shared the news himself. Now seeing Steffy break, Finn felt a deep ache of his own, not just as a doctor who hated the limitations of medicine, who hated the quiet cruelty of late-stage diagnoses, but as a man who had grown to respect Nick over the years. He held Steffy tighter, promising they would support him, promising she wasn't alone, but Steffy kept shaking her head, crying about how unfair it all was, how tired she was of losing people, how terrified she was for Nick, and for what this meant for everyone connected to him. Meanwhile, Brooke remained with Nick until the sun outside the hospital windows shifted from afternoon gold to early evening blue, refusing to leave him alone with the darkness closing in. She listened as he confessed fears he had never spoken aloud, about Jack, about regrets, about the memories he wished he had more time to make. He asked her quietly if she thought people would remember him for the good or the bad. Brooke, with tears streaming freely now, told him the truth. That he had lived boldly, loved fiercely, fought passionately, and yes, stumbled often, but that his imperfections were part of what made him human, and humanity was what people remembered most. She told him that people didn't need perfection to love someone. They needed honesty, courage, and heart, all things Nick had in abundance. They talked about the past, about boats and storms and laughter and heartbreak, about the strange, beautiful, impossible path that had brought them back into each other's orbit at this moment. When Nick finally broke down, shoulders shaking as he whispered that he didn't want to die, Brooke wrapped her arms around him and held him as tightly as she could, as though sheer willpower and love might hold him together. Later, when Steffy gathered the strength to walk to Nick's room, she paused at the doorway when she saw Brooke comforting him. For a moment Steffy's tears returned, but this time there was something else too: gratitude. Because she knew Nick needed Brooke right now. And Brooke, whose heart had been broken and rebuilt more times than anyone could count, knew how to hold someone through the darkest moments. When Steffy finally stepped inside, Nick looked up, and the second he saw her trembling, he opened his arms without hesitation. Steffy collapsed into him, crying into his shoulder as she begged him not to give up, not to surrender, not to shut them out of the fight. Nick, voice quiet but steady, told her he wasn't giving up. He was scared, but he wasn't done. Not yet. Brooke placed a hand on Steffy's back, grounding her, reminding her that they were a family of fighters. And in that small hospital room, 3 lives intertwined by complicated history and lingering loyalty made an unspoken pact, to face whatever came next together, to fight the impossible odds, to hold on to hope even when the world seemed determined to take it away. Because at the end of the day, in a world filled with betrayals, secrets, and shifting alliances, moments like this peeled away the noise and revealed what truly mattered: love, connection, courage, and the desperate, stubborn belief that even in the darkest moments, miracles could still find their way through. But the night didn't end there. In fact, it felt like the world somehow became quieter and heavier as the hours crept on, as though the hospital walls could sense the fear, the desperation, and the fragile hope that clung to the people inside. After Steffy finally pulled herself together enough to leave the room, Brooke stayed, refusing to walk away even though her own heart felt like it had been thrown into a storm of memories and dread. She watched Nick drift into an uneasy sleep, his breathing uneven, his face lined with exhaustion that went deeper than physical fatigue. She stepped outside into the hallway, needing a moment to catch her breath, only to find Ridge standing there, having been called by Finn after he realized Brooke needed support whether she admitted it or not. Ridge didn't speak right away. He simply searched her face, and when he saw the strain around her eyes, the way her shoulders sagged, the way she seemed to be holding herself upright through sheer will, he knew something catastrophic had happened. When she finally whispered, "It's Nick." Stage 4. Ridge felt his chest tighten in a way he didn't expect. Nick had once been a rival, a challenger, a man Ridge alternately respected, resented, admired, and competed with. Their history was messy, complicated, often volatile, but it was real, and hearing that a man who had once stood toe-to-toe with him was now staring down the possibility of death hit Ridge harder than he would ever admit out loud. Without a word, he pulled Brooke into his arms, letting her sink into the comfort she had denied herself for hours. Brooke didn't cry loudly. She didn't have the strength left for dramatic sobs, but she pressed her face into Ridge's chest, letting silent tears fall as he stroked her back gently, grounding her, reminding her that she didn't have to hold the world together on her own. Meanwhile, Steffy had retreated to a quiet corner of the hospital, unable to drive home yet, her mind spinning in a chaotic whirlwind of grief, fear, and memories of Nick as a strong presence in her life. The man who had helped her understand resilience years ago. The man who had once guided her with tough love. The man who had been both an enemy and a mentor depending on the season. She felt Finn approach before she heard him, his familiar presence easing some of the panic gripping her chest. He sat beside her, taking her hand in his, and for a moment they didn't speak, simply sharing their grief in silence. When Finn finally did speak, his voice was low and steady. He explained what the chart didn't show, the nuance beyond the terrifying words stage 4. He told her there were still treatment options, immunotherapy, targeted therapy, clinical trials, each carrying risks, each offering hope in different measures. Steffy clung to those words like a lifeline, needing something, anything to fight for. Because she wasn't ready to lose someone else. Not after the chaos of the past year. Not after losing peace, nearly losing her marriage, nearly losing her mind trying to navigate the constant battles with Sheila, and the endless pressure of being a Forrester. She needed this fight to mean something. She needed to believe they could save him. As the hours passed, word of Nick's diagnosis quietly spread among the people who had once been part of his life. Taylor, who happened to be finishing a late-night shift consulting with hospital staff on a psychiatric case, froze when she overheard two nurses discussing the situation. She hurried down the hallway, driven by instinct, and when she saw Brooke and Ridge outside Nick's room, their body language told her everything she needed to know. Brooke didn't even try to hide her tears. She simply opened her arms, allowing Taylor to step into the shared grief without hesitation. For once, the rivalry, the decades of romantic entanglements, the complicated past, they all fell away. There was no competition tonight. No old wounds reopened. Just three people bound by concern for someone who had touched all their lives in different ways. Taylor offered to speak with Nick when he awoke, not just as a doctor, but as someone who had understood him deeply once upon a time. Brooke nodded gratefully, knowing Nick might open up to Taylor in ways he couldn't with her. Not because he loved Brooke any less, but because grief had strange rules, and sometimes the heart spoke differently depending on who was listening. Meanwhile, outside the hospital, life went on in its usual rhythm, unaware that inside those walls, one man's fate was sparking emotional tremors across multiple families. At Forrester Creations, the late-night cleaning crew moved through empty rooms, oblivious to the silent chaos unfolding across town. At Spencer Publications, the security guards made their rounds, having no idea that Bill Spencer would soon receive news that would punch him in the chest harder than any corporate war ever had. Because when Bill learned about Nick's diagnosis later that night through an urgent message from Ridge, short, direct, lacking his usual bravado, he went completely still. Nick Marone had been many things in Bill's world. A rival, a nuisance, a stubborn competitor, a man who refused to be intimidated by Bill's power. They had clashed over business, over pride, over women, over territory. And yet Bill respected him, more than he respected most men. He respected Nick's grit, his relentless drive, his moral compass that, though imperfect, was never hypocritical. The thought of a man like that facing death seized Bill with a rare emotion, helplessness. And Bill Spencer hated feeling helpless. Back at the hospital, Steffi had finally steadied her breathing enough to walk back to Nick's room, needing to see him again, terrified he might wake up alone and afraid. She found Brooke and Ridge still standing together, speaking softly, and when Brooke saw her approach, she pulled Steffi into a hug as though she were her own daughter. There were no sides today. No Forrester versus Logan tension. Just fear and the determination to hold each other up. When Nick finally woke, his eyes unfocused and heavy, he saw Brooke, Ridge, and Steffi surrounding him, and for a moment confusion flickered across his face. Then he remembered. He remembered the diagnosis. The weight of it crushed him again, but this time seeing them there, These complicated, intertwined people softened the blow just enough for him to take a breath without collapsing. He tried to joke, tried to ease the heaviness, tried to pretend he wasn't terrified, but his voice cracked, betraying him. Steffy moved to his bedside, taking his hand with a steadiness that surprised even her. She told him she wasn't afraid of the fight, and she wouldn't let him be either. Brooke echoed her words, promising that whatever he chose, treatment, trials, anything, they would support him. Ridge, emotional in a quiet, restrained way, told Nick that he wasn't allowed to give up yet because whether they liked it or not, they still had unfinished business. Nick let out a weak laugh, the sound tinged with pain but also gratitude. For the first time since receiving his diagnosis, he didn't feel alone. Hours later, after the initial storm had settled into a quiet, fragile calm, Finn returned with a stack of medical printouts, options, statistics, possible outcomes. He explained each treatment path in detail, refusing to sugarcoat the risks but also refusing to extinguish hope. Nick listened intently, absorbing every word, every percentage, every unfamiliar medical term that suddenly carried the weight of his future. He asked hard questions about survival rates, about side effects, about time. Finn answered with honesty and compassion, treating him not just as a patient, but as someone whose life mattered deeply to the people he loved. Nick finally admitted he was scared not of dying, but of choosing wrong, choosing a treatment that prolonged suffering without adding quality of life. Brooke squeezed his arm, reminding him that whatever decision he made, it would be the right one because it would be his choice, not fear's choice. Taylor added that fear was natural, but couldn't be allowed to become the voice that made decisions for him. Steffy, voice trembling with conviction, told him she wasn't ready to say goodbye, and that she needed him to stay, not for her sake, but because he had more life to live, more impact to make, more love to give. Something in her words shifted Nick. His expression changed, his posture straightened slightly, as though a spark of determination flickered back to life. That was when Finn introduced the possibility of a clinical trial. A new immunotherapy protocol showing promising results in a handful of patients with aggressive late-stage cancers. It wasn't guaranteed. It wasn't safe. It wasn't easy. But it was a chance. A real one. Nick's eyes met Brooke's, then Ridge's, then Steffy's, and he finally whispered, "I'll fight. I'm not done yet." The room exhaled collectively, the first breath of real hope since the nightmare began. Brooke felt her heart swell with relief, pride, and fear all at once. Ridge placed a steady hand on Nick's shoulder. Steffy nodded with fierce determination, her tears drying into something stronger, resolve. And just like that, the battle began. Not with medical equipment or paperwork, but with a decision, a spark of courage, a refusal to surrender. The hospital, once silent and looming, now felt like neutral ground. A battlefield where everyone present was prepared to fight not just for Nick's life, but for the possibility of healing old wounds, mending broken connections, and rediscovering the strength that came from standing together through the darkest storms. Because even though tomorrow promised uncertainty, tonight had carved something unbreakable. A bond formed in crisis, a hope born in fear, and a reminder that even at the darkest moment, family, chosen or blood, was the light that refused to go out. As the first pale hints of morning filtered through the hospital windows, casting long streaks of soft gold across the floor, the atmosphere in Nick's room shifted from the heaviness of night towards something quieter, more fragile, but undeniably hopeful. Brooke sat beside him, her fingers gently wrapped around his hand, tracing small circles against his skin as if grounding him to the world with each touch. She watched the light settle across his face, softening the exhaustion etched into his features, and for a brief moment she allowed herself to imagine that this morning might be the start of something new. Not easy, not certain, but possible. Steffy stood near the foot of the bed, arms wrapped around herself, wiping the remnants of last night's tears as she tried to compose the strength she knew Nick needed to see. Ridge lingered by the doorway, protective, alert, and unusually quiet, watching everyone with the solemn understanding that their unity now mattered more than any past conflicts. When Nick stirred, slowly opening his eyes to the gentle light, there was a flicker of something new in them. Determination, maybe, or acceptance, or perhaps the first fragile thread of courage that comes after a night spent confronting your worst fears. Finn entered with a soft knock, carrying the morning's lab results and a cautious smile that didn't promise miracles but suggested that the battle ahead wasn't hopeless. Nick took a deep breath, glancing at each of them, Brooke, Steffy, Ridge, Finn, and the gratitude in his expression said more than words ever could. For the first time since the diagnosis shattered his world, he didn't feel like a man dying. He felt like a man fighting, anchored by the people who refused to let him face the darkness alone.